At 11 p.m. on the night of the 16th, the nation of Rakadan launches a surprise offensive against their longtime rival, Kosrt. A fierce bombing campaign targets leadership and military capability. As the sun rises, the invaders turn their sights to the strongly defended border. In the following days, the most advanced artillery in the world turns unprepared fortresses into rubble. 12 days later, on the 28th, Kosrt surrenders, becoming just another state in a united Rakadan, its wealth of resources added to the coffers of the victor. It was a campaign that left the world stunned. No one could have predicted the swift defeat of Kosrt. It was lightning war, not focused on long sieges, but on mobility and ruining the nation's ability to make war in the first place. On this battlefield, victories were credited to wealth and technology, not valor. Put another way, in the early hours of the morning of the 17th, the nation of Rakadan launches a surprise offensive against their longtime rival, Kosrt. High-level fighting teams teleport into the enemy capital, striking at the palace, royal residences, and military leadership. Giants, elementals, and powerful magics combine with a professional military. In less than 2 weeks, one of the major powers of the region is defeated. Hello and welcome to Pellicar. This is Nuts and Bolts, episode 17, Fantasy Warfare Edition, part 1. This is the show where we talk about world building as it pertains to RPGs, storytelling, and Dresden's Tale in particular. I've been living the dream for about 35 years now. Been involved in gaming of one sort or another for most of that time. I've run some great campaigns. I've done some writing and published a few things. Am I an expert? In some cases, I'm confident I can say yes. In others, not so much. Today, however, we're talking about fantasy warfare, and on this one, you can trust me. How did Rakadan pull off such a sweeping victory? Let's start with some background. The two nations exist side by side in a sizable community of independent states. These vary by race, species, government, and religion. Over the years, the area has seen plenty of politics and war. For generations, two factors have been paramount. First, defense over offense. 100 years ago, wars usually consisted of large armies moving through rural lands and laying waste to farming economies, or putting in long sieges against walled cities. The outcome was always the same. After a few months, regional pressure would start to build as the hostilities upset trade and the general stability of the region. Second was the segregation of fighting groups from the daily business of local governments. The biggest hurdle was the traditions of noble lineage. Without a generational history of wealth, it was difficult for new money to carve out a place at the table. Often, there was no reason to try. Wealthy adventurers could live very well in the cities of the land, where they might train, maintain families, or simply enjoy the entertainment provided within urban settings. Otherwise, they might spend years at a time chasing treasure and fame. Over time, proactive powers strove to make changes, so they were ready when it was once again time for war. On that first night, leadership targets were of high importance. Defense-penetrating scries confirm the location of high officials before teleports are initiated. Korst's Lord General, Minister of Arms, and Grand Vizier of the Coin are of particular interest and are eliminated in the first minutes of the war. The king survives, but many of his advisors are killed or captured. The attack is over even as the Royal Guard is being called to alert. An hour later, a second round of action is deployed against softer targets. Using simple combustion-enhancing magics, teams begin major fires in the commercial and industrial quarters of the capital and other core cities. Granaries, markets, wagon yards, and armories are set aflame. In the city of Hamster, a firestorm takes hold. Hundreds are killed and thousands made homeless when the inferno moves into residential sectors of the city. With the sunrise, the teleport teams leap into action yet again, this time targeting Korst's defenses along the strongly defended River of Denial. A natural boundary, the wide river has long served as a path for trade and bulwark against aggression. Larger in scale, the second wave of the assault is meant to weaken the morale of an unsuspecting army. Summoned earth elementals infiltrate the earthworks of Fort Gamstead, killing hundreds before a priest arrives to banish the invader. Hired water giants undermine the riverfront walls of Fort Cerestia, tearing open the hard shell of a castle once considered unbreakable. The fighting teams themselves engage whole companies of regular soldiers, turning the vaunted Kosrt Unity Guard into the war's first shattered division. Where troops try to fight in formation, concentrated spellfire kills on a mass scale. Spreading out only encourages veteran mercenaries to sweep in and cleave havoc. In the following days, further strikes take down bridges to cut off reinforcements. Constant raids continue to cripple Kosrt command and control. Meanwhile, infantry crosses the denial, but even now, the goal is not to meet the enemy head-to-head. Heroic fighting teams and powerful beasts keep the defenders in their forts while the armies of Rakadan spread out and swallow up the rural expanses of a dying kingdom. The trade cities of Tabith, Meredith, and Odette fall within days. Beaten, the king of Kosrt flees on the 28th. The next day, victory is declared. Kosrt becomes a Rakadan state, its wealth of resources added to the coffers of the victor. No one could have predicted the swift defeat of Kosrt. It was lightning war, not focused on long marches and the engagement of armies, but on pitting overwhelming force on vulnerable leaderships and infrastructure. The losers called it the end of honor and the death of military tradition. So why pick on Kosrt? According to pre-war rhetoric, the rival nation had long been interfering in the internal affairs of Rakadan. Accusations of heresy were a favorite talking point. Where no differences were present, they were invented. Sometimes this was done to drive up attendance and donations for the church's coffers. It was always produced with the intent of fueling nationalist zeal. When it came to war, the populace cheered it. For over a decade, claims were made against the West Bank of the Nile. These usually included the ancient history of the region when barbarian clans came together along the length of the river. Rakadan claimed this created a singular culture, one which should have been under one government, theirs. Ultimately, the cool, calculating fuel that powered the war machine was wealth and power. In the mountains around the capital, Kosrt profited from rich deposits of gold. In the hills of the west, deposits of gypsum prevailed, along with high-quality crystal selenite. Copper, topaz, and coal existed in Kosrt territory as well. Controlling both banks of the river would mean an increase in revenue brought on by reduced competition, and the possession of the trade cities greatly extends the range of Rakadan trade routes. For those on the fence about the war and the adventurer mercenaries who had to be paid, promises of land often made the difference. 2 of the teleport-capable mages were among the most expensive of the hirees. One gains a 30% stake in a gold mine, guaranteeing him income for life. The second is made a duchess and handed over a small town with promises not to question the research that might go on there. There were many heroes in this victory. Some needed more convincing than others. Everett the Hammer kills 40 men in 15 minutes on the first day of the war. His price was merely that his life be made into a play and shown across the theaters of Rakadan no less than twice a year. Gauze the Blue worked tirelessly in clouding scries and tracking enemy assets in the weeks leading up to the war. The Bone Lance Cavalry swept through 100 miles of enemy territory in 3 days. Let's take another look at how we got here so we can better understand how things changed. What was normal in the last 2 centuries? Simply put, it looked a lot more like our ancient era. For generations, wars were fought by soldiers, not leveled adventurers. And there were a lot of reasons for this. For one, a lack of national identity among the adventuring class. Teams consisted of warriors from many different cultures, and they usually didn't align with any single government. And there was a great misunderstanding on the part of the states on how valuable and what potential these fighting teams might have. Another problem was tactics. It was very easy for even an experienced team to be overwhelmed by regular infantry. A few thousand against a small team was dangerous. Just a few incidents over the course of time greatly influenced the opinion of warriors. Now, it's not like we're fighting dragons here. They're just infantry. Fight an army? They're like a swarm of pissed-off kobolds. I'll take the dragon. And dragons have treasure. It was time for a change in strategy. Over the years, a number of steps were taken to alter the dynamics of the mercenary, regular military dynamic. Simply including powerful adventuring types in the planning changed things greatly. They were able to deploy new strategies, making the battlefield better for adventuring types and their rank-and-file allies. High-level planning began to identify attainable magics and methods that might be combined into a cohesive asset package. Next, laws were changed on a national level to encourage friendly fighting teams. Among these were a taxation and registration program that gave Rakadan majority fighting teams advantages in making the kingdom their home. They were offered a route into the landed nobility. This gave them political power and an easier life for their families. More important to some, restrictions were lifted over their training packages and research projects that they might become involved in. A blind eye was turned to alchemy, necromancy, and enchantment just to accommodate these powerful warriors. More quietly, the entire local thieves guild was absorbed into the Ministry of Intelligence. And therein lies the theme of this entire series, or sub-series, or this warfare thing we're talking about. What happens when you take the grand battles of antiquity and add magic and other elements of the fantasy genre? Yeah, it's not just magic. What happens whenever you throw a high-level fighter into the Battle of Falkirk? Results will vary. What if it's a stone giant? This is going to be the show where we talk about that stuff. This is not the show where we're going to talk about how Game of Thrones did it. There's already plenty of material on that and all the other fantasy staples. There will often be a Dresden's Tale slant, because really, that's why we're all here. In any given show, on any given topic, there are about 1 million things we can talk about. For that reason, many of these early episodes are going to be a little bit here and there as we lay down background information for future episodes. So, with our sights narrowed on the invasion of Kosrt, let's see what else we can shove into this 30-minute episode. The story of Gaz the Blue is pivotal for our narrative. Now, a lot of warfare is building a better mousetrap. Better armor requires stronger projectiles. Stronger projectiles means you need better armor, so on and so forth. In the remote viewing game, Gaz is the current pinnacle of his specialty. He was the first great strategic asset in the prelude to war. Depending upon the particulars of your story, he could have been a high-ranking divination wizard or a priest of a god with provinces in the field. He would have certainly been supported by top-tier magical devices. No matter his character sheet, the presence of Gaz let the Rakadans transition from the hypothetical to real tactical training with no fear of being found out by simple divinations. Let's remember, basic yes-no portents are fairly common. In most rule sets, defeating them is usually passed by, but the ability would not be hard to develop. Oh, and the neighbors will ask. If I were king, I promise you the local churches would be expected to divine threats from time to time. Gaz not only would have been responsible for misdirecting these efforts, but would have also put out a few false flags to keep Korst's best and brightest busy elsewhere. As the invasion day drew closer, the diviner would have maintained a detailed list of current locations and habits of all the important actors of Kosrt. In Dresden's Tale, the most likely head of such an operation would have been a priest of Dalius, with rituals and other advanced skills, specializing him or her towards the task. Alyssa the Bold was the second behind-the-scenes hero of the invasion. Some would say it was entirely her doing. Ultranationalist before it was cool, this daughter of a political powerhouse of a family was born with a Rakadan flag in her hand. She knew one thing: everybody else sucked. Brains combined with zeal made this monkey warhawk a force to reckon with from a very young age. Alyssa took up the sword and fought in every war her motherland waged for 50 years. For the next 20, she served as a mercenary. Alyssa learned a lot fighting in foreign conflicts, but seeing every war-torn nation at its worst only reinforced the pride in her homeland. Unwilling to pivot from a warfighter to an adventurer, she turned her hungry mind to knowledge while continuing to dabble in politics. 100 words of backstory wasted? Never. Motivation matters. Allie is important to our story for two reasons. The first is that every war needs an instigator. It's often not the loudest or even the national leader. It's usually someone tucked well back into the shadows. Next, she was always the smartest person in the room during all those closed-door planning sessions. Finally, never underestimate the power of a sage. It was Alyssa who decoded the ancient manuscripts to locate the Scroll of Crossing. The red-hued simian sent Rakadan's adventurers off on dungeon crawls all across the region, looking for just the right tools for conquest. She's the one who learned the history of the water giants, so they might find cultural cues to facilitate their enrollment into the effort. It was Tilly the Tall who Alyssa recruited to be ambassador to those water giants, so execute segue. Tilly, well, Tilly's tall, but mostly Tilly is a badass. They were not only chosen to befriend the giants, but later entrusted with the Scroll of Crossing. Tilly's career began 15 years earlier and has been an active one. Going right into odd mercenary jobs, they quickly found themselves gaining wealth and power. By the time Tilly stepped into the battlefield of the invasion, no soldier, man or woman, could stand against them. In the early hours of the attack, Tilly was part of the teleport teams that sent the capital into a chaotic spiral. Later, the warriors single-handedly took the gatehouse at Fort Celestia, in the process killing dozens of castle defenders. In the following weeks, tallies put Tilly's kills well into the hundreds, never once having to retreat from the field. Now what convinced Tilly to fight for Rakadan? It wasn't the glory. For years after, they would complain that the gruesome body count weighed heavily. It wasn't the gold. Tilly had raided many a dragon horde and demon's lair by the time of the battle. The adventurer would later admit it was for the stability. Fighting for the crown came with a 1,000-acre tea plantation and tax revenue from towns located adjacent. Sometimes the ultimate reward is retirement. Now what about this Scroll of Crossing? Handing out powerful magic is always a danger, but handing out one-shots is the creator's ticket to the fun zone without ruining the world he or she built. The planners of the invasion knew crossing the Nile was going to be difficult, so they found an answer. Stuff like this is where you can really enhance the story, whether it's the opening moves of an ongoing campaign or a novel. This scroll has a great backstory, dating all the way back to the time of legends, when some great hero possessed the pen of Ariakis. The quill allowed the wielder to create pictures, perfect drawings of pretty much anything, but the subject of the painting would be absorbed. Sounds powerful, but such an effort might take hours or even days to pull off. The more tactical application of the pen is later evoking the scroll and recreating the object. Now the pen is lost, but there are still scrolls around to be utilized. This one had been located and an adventuring team dispatched to recover it. A dungeon crawl made to order. This single preparatory act allowed Rakadan to move 3,000 heavy cavalry, the Bone Lancers, across the wide river in a swift single movement. There is a price to be paid for wrapping yourself in the flag of Warhawk nationalism. Often, the price is your morality. Feel free to argue in the comments whether necromancy is evil by nature, but it's a distinct step in that direction. As Rakadan moved towards a military stance, they knew they had to lure the many adventurer types who dabbled in the gray. Depending upon the details of your setting, this could take a number of forms. In Dresden's world, it would have been the Church of Oggs. All Keld religions are warlike. Oggs focuses in two directions. First, the church performs the task of maintaining graveyards and performing burial services. Second, they produce their own army. an army of the dead, animated from the corpses of fallen enemies. The Bone Lancers are the warm and fuzzy side of necromancy, animating dead horses, lizard steeds, cattle, basically anything that can be saddled and ridden. Mounted by living cavalry, the advantages should be obvious. You may rule they are slower. Certainly, a skeletal steed is no match in head-to-head versus a living equivalent. However, you don't have to feed them, and they don't get tired. When you're sweeping across the open plains behind front-line defenses, that can shave days off an occupation. The Bone Lancers devastated farming centers and trade posts before many even knew the war had begun. They caught bands of soldiers as they reported to their rally points. The Lancers suppressed opposition and captured bridges deep into enemy territory. At a tactical level, mobility won the war. Victory was achieved on the first day when strong fighting teams teleported into the Kosrt capital. They killed leadership targets and broke the enemy's will to fight. In the following week, battlefield heroes and legendary beasts were turned loose on well-trained but unprepared armies. Is this the end of infantry? Of course not. Nothing holds territory like a division of spearmen, but taking the land to start with is an entirely different tale. As for this series, this is how we're going to do it. I could talk for hours about the tiny moves and countless heroics of any war, even a short one. That's just not how we do it on YouTube. Instead, I hope to knock out regular episodes over time. We'll build up a nice library of talking points. We'll contrast, compare, and analyze. If you want to be a part of it, take a moment and leave a comment. What do you agree with? Where did I get it wrong? What would you like to see a future episode talk about in more detail? Sometimes we'll play with these scenarios. Other times we'll stick to more basic concepts. For supplemental shorts, we might just take a quick look at possible fantastic military units. I appreciate that you took the time to visit my channel. You could have been doing anything, but you chose to spend a little time with me. That's pretty cool. Before you go, hit that like button. It really does help. Subscribe if you want to inspire me to write more, and leave a comment so I know what videos you are enjoying the most. My name is Lewis Nichols, and thank you for dropping by. Cheers. Appendix number 1. We're going to do these single take style, so hold on to your hats. The rules for your world and how they affect our discussion. How does your fatigue work? High-level fighters face 2 issues when fighting regular military: fatigue and entanglement. In both cases, the balance is very much up to your game rules or fantasy world physics. In my world, a warrior can fight for a base of around 5 minutes before suffering lasting consequences. Attack bonuses drop off sharply, and they may suffer short-term losses of stamina. It could require days or weeks to recover. However, they might easily kill 50 or 100 men in this time, if they can avoid entanglement and grappling attempts. A fighter with the right skills can greatly enhance the longevity in battle by taking skills to better utilize their stamina score and to avoid being overborne. In your system, it might be different. Another factor is how spellcasting works. Again, in my system, there are no classes. Anyone with the time and money and skills available can learn to pocket space. This is my equivalent to teleport. It is more limited in many ways, but you don't have to be a high-ranking mage to use it. You might have easy transport via magical devices, gate tech, alchemy, or magical beasts. Conversely, teleport options might be unheard of in your domains. Hence, the rules of your game world will determine if my ramblings are of any use to you at all. Appendix number 2, Scry and Counter Scry. I feel like this is one of the main topics of today's videos that I might consider a closed issue in the future. That's not going to be true for most things. For instance, I brushed over the mobility of cavalry, but you can believe that I will be talking about cavalry again at length. Alright, so Scry. The main point I want you to take away on this set of skills is it's a big deal. Espionage, whether in peace or in warfare, is huge. Study any big war, and you're going to see espionage efforts trying to fool the enemy, trying to break codes. Scry and counter scry is the magical application of this. Even in a relatively peaceful world, nation states will still want to stay informed about their neighbors and rivals. There will probably be international conventions on the use of remote viewing, and they will probably be broken on a regular basis. A lot of games give you just a few basic options to address this kind of activity, but I urge you to fill in the gaps. For every measure, there is a countermeasure. For every defense, there is a way to overcome. Low-ranking casters might have simple yes-no portents available. Later, they might find a crystal ball or learn to commune with spirits. There must always be devices to confuse these attempts. I'm not even there yet in my own world building, but I foresee a system where godly magic, earthly magic, enchantment, alchemy, and innate ability come together to form a web of possibilities. Next appendix, the power of the sage. Yeah, this one needs a whole episode. If you didn't pick it up, and I don't think I said it directly, one of the things Rakadan did right was put the power of the state behind endeavors usually left to adventurers. Their sage, Alyssa, used the resources of Rakadan to find everything from magical siege weaponry to the scroll that let a whole army cross an uncrossable river. Relatively simple devices like a wand of fireballs becomes a devastating weapon on the battlefield. So she identified dungeons where they might lie and dispatched fighting teams to recover them. Knowledge is power, and sages are the ones that wield it in the fantasy world setting. In yours, it might be a holy order of monks, or some wizened old dragon with a library dating back 1,000 years. Maybe your party will hunt down the original authors of those books, or other source material. In any of these cases, it's the sages taking the lead. Don't forget them. They deserve their time to shine, just like the fighters and the wizards.